That's just great. So we've got, let's see, martial law, single point of entry, more cops, more military, school snitching, fences, locked doors, bulletproof glass, death sentences, decreasing social media exposure, tripwires, trapping shooters like rats, interlocking doors, fighting an anti-police narrative, taking kids to church, enhanced body armor, more assault rifles, and by the way, snowflakes, don't get triggered. Yeah, boy, I'm so glad that I have the gun so that I can avoid a tyranny. This doesn't feel tyrannical at all. This feels perfectly normal for a normal society, a functioning free society. This seems perfectly fine. What am I concerned about? In the wake of the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, there has been a lot of discussion about how to curb gun violence, which is a discussion that, as you might know, some people don't want to have at all. Of course, the thing about it is that it's very hard to have a waiting period when we have over 200 shootings on record this year alone in the United States. You pretty much just get over one just in time for another one to happen, and the cycle continues. And you might be thinking that at this point, somebody might talk about, gun reform or some kind of gun laws, and there are, but no one seems to really be taking that seriously, and instead coming up with a whole bunch of ludicrous ideas on what you could do. There was a list of 50 different ideas that people have come up with, and it got me to thinking about something that's come up periodically in my thought process the last couple years, which is the big argument why the Second Amendment is so important, why the right to bear arms is seen as so vehemently necessary for democracy, and that is that it protects all the other rights, that we need the guns to prevent a tyranny. And the problem with that narrative is that I now believe more fully than ever, especially with how we perceive guns in this country, that it actually does far more to enable tyranny than prevent it. But let's take that first point for 1 second, that it protects all the other rights. Well, when a gunman goes into a church or a school or a shopping center or onto the Vegas Strip or into a nightclub and shoots a bunch of people, a lot of Americans just got all their rights taken away from them. So the argument about the Second Amendment protecting all other rights starts to ring a little hollow in that regard. One person's right to bear arms was more important than all the rights of tens, if not hundreds of people when it comes to the overarching number. But on the topic of tyranny, first of all, are you sure that the people that have the guns would be fighting against the tyrant or for them? Think about that for a second. Second, you have a problem where the idea that the second you take away guns, you create a tyranny is undercut by all of the places in the world where that didn't happen. England has incredibly strict gun laws. Is England a tyranny? I mean, some people probably would argue that, but like in tyranny like you think it is. Japan has a law that says that you can't own guns or swords. Is Japan a tyranny? I don't think the Japanese would argue that it is. And anyone who wants to go and visit there wouldn't say that it is. They have a functioning democracy. They're affluent. Even in cases where the tyranny came to pass and there was gun restrictions, I would make the argument that often the gun restrictions came well after the tyranny was already established. If you look at a North Korea and Kim Il-sung that led to Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, they did take away guns. They're massively restricted there, but that is also a culture where they proclaimed that this family were gods. And as far as I'm aware, that whole thing came before any of the gun legislation happened. They had already established that there were god kings among them. And that feels like more of a disinformation campaign that eventually led to a tyranny that then took away guns. So the guns didn't prevent the tyranny. But that kind of leads us to the main thesis point here. Guns can create a tyranny just as easily as it can prevent that tyranny. You saw those 50 different ideas for how to stop gun violence that have nothing to do with restricting guns. The problem is that those look pretty tyrannical. It's about military-style lockdowns, martial law, putting people in cages, trapping people like rats, more police, the militarization of the police, more government control in terms of having agents of the state manage that. Just a lot of stuff that you would normally associate with tyrannies. Bulletproof glass, additional body armor. That feels like you're trying to create a tyranny instead of prevent one. So that you can have the guns that are going to prevent the tyranny that you're building anyway. But then just go and look at the right, who is promoting the fact that we can't talk about gun legislation. Because tyranny, what else are they doing? Well, they're trying to make it so that you can't talk about gay or trans people. They're trying to ban books from schools. They're trying to ban abortion. I thought we were trying to get rid of tyranny here. But it seems like you're actually using guns as a single issue voting point so that people will vote for you just so that you can put tyrannical ideas in place, tyrannical legislation in place. You're trying to create a tyranny and you're using the crux people have for guns in order to make that happen. See, this is where we get into the real heart of the matter, as far as I'm concerned at least, about why gun violence is such a problem in the United States. And believe it or not, for me, it isn't necessarily that we don't have enough legislation or that we should take away guns, because I think that that's systemic to the actual underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that we have become a culture that fetishizes guns. It's not just that we own them. They are a part of our personality. When you talk to a lot of people that own guns, it's not just an object to them. It is part of their very identity. It is part of their very self-worth. To suggest taking away their gun is to suggest taking a part of their very essence, their being, away. And that's the whole problem. We're a society that tells kids from a very early age that one of the easiest and quickest ways to solve any problem is to shoot it. We don't really give them a lot of other mechanisms to try and work through problems. We don't do problem solving here. I mean, how often have you gone to a movie and you heard somebody say, just shoot him? Because for us, that is the go-to solution. Violence is not the last option for us. Violence is like the first and sometimes only option we entertain. That's your problem right there. It's not hard to figure that part out. And as soon as you start to realize that, you can fix it. Let's create a new narrative to start. Our solution to problems has quickly become, if you don't like something, you just shoot it. And for the record, that just makes people terrorized in their own homes and their cities and their towns. And that means that we can pass even more restrictive militarized style policing that creates the kind of police state you would associate with a tyranny. See? It all kind of circles back to it eventually. People talk about the slippery slope. The second you start any kind of gun legislation, slide right down into tyranny. But people never get around to talking about how the slippery slope is on both sides. You back up away from any kind of comprehensive gun law, and eventually you tumble down the other side. And when you tumble down the other side, you end up with anarchy. The problem there is that out of anarchy, people get desperate. In the chaos, somebody rises up and becomes a tyrant. You just circle right back around to where you were trying to prevent anyway. And again, another stupid thing is You're never going to prevent a tyranny if you think you're going to do it with guns. It was never going to work. The military will always have bigger guns than you. That's not going to change. They are not going to let you have a howitzer. They are not going to let you have rocket launchers and F-18 fighters. They're not going to do that. I'm sorry. The police and the military, which we are continually funding more and more because we're not talking about guns and the violence that causes, so we have to create more policing to compensate. They have more guns. They have bigger guns. They have more armor. If you are thinking of taking on the U.S. government with your AR-15, you are going to be in for a very, very rude awakening. But the thing about it is that the Second Amendment was really not built for you to, take on the government. Right. I probably should have led with that. The Second Amendment is meant so that you can stand between the elected officials you put into Washington and whoever is coming across the ocean to try and take us over. That was the whole point. To create a well-regulated militia. You remember that part of the Second Amendment? That wasn't so we could overthrow the government. That was to protect the government from outside forces that were going to overthrow them. You get that, right? You were cannon fodder so that the government could maintain control. Now, later we extrapolated that and said that we could also use it to avoid a tyranny. But we aren't going to do that anyway. Because it's very likely that if you had a would-be tyrant that rose up and started talking about all these very restrictive things, trying to go after minority groups, trying to consolidate the chauvinistic kind of view of the West, cracking down on women's rights, gay rights, people's ability to learn or understand things, or their access to media, or, I don't know, books, and suggesting maybe that we even start burning them. They'd probably be looking forward to having the folks with the guns join them. And keeping their access to those guns would be a really good way to shore up their support, to create a tyranny, not prevent one. And if all you really care about is whether you have access to a weapon or not, then they have you over a barrel. They will pass every other restrictive law imaginable because they know that if all you really care about is the gun, they can take away all your other rights without you blinking an eye. It's a trap. It has been a trap in this country for decades. And we fell for it. Hard. Your prophecy for the day. If you hear about a tragic school shooting and all the pain and horror that comes along with it, and your first thought is, they better not take away my gun, you are part of the problem.